The sun had barely crested the horizon when a piercing scream shattered the morning silence. Sarah jolted awake, heart racing. She rushed to the window, peering out to see her neighbor, David, shouting and gesticulating wildly. Across the fence, David's face was flushed with fury. "You can't do this," he bellowed. "This is illegal." Sarah's brow furrowed as she watched the confrontation unfold. David's wife, Jessica, stood calmly beside him, her expression unreadable. Facing them was a crew of uniformed men, methodically dismantling what appeared to be an air conditioning unit on David's patio. Gripped by a mixture of confusion and dread, Sarah hurried outside, her robe fluttering behind her. "What's going on?" she demanded, approaching the heated standoff. David whirled around, his eyes wild. "They're taking my AC unit," he cried. "These men have no right to do this." One of the uniformed men stepped forward, his voice measured. "Sir, we have a court order authorizing the removal of this illegal installation. You were warned multiple times about the violation." Jessica placed a hand on David's arm, her tone placating. "Honey, you knew this was coming. We have to follow the rules." David shrugged off her touch, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. "Screw the rules. This is my home, and I'll do what I damn well please." Sarah watched the exchange, her heart sinking. She had a sinking feeling she knew where this was headed. Tensions were running high, and she feared the situation could quickly spiral out of control. Suddenly, David turned and rushed back into his house, reappearing moments later wielding a baseball bat. "I won't let you take it," he screamed, swinging the bat wildly at the workers. The men scrambled to avoid the blows, some of them shouting for backup. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as the confrontation devolved into chaos. "Stop," she cried, rushing forward in a futile attempt to intervene. "David, please, this isn't going to help." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. David continued his frenzied assault, his bat connecting with one of the worker's shoulders with a sickening thud. The man crumpled to the ground, clutching his injury. Sirens blared in the distance, and Sarah knew the police were on their way. She prayed they would arrive in time to prevent further violence. David, seemingly oblivious to the growing pandemonium, continued his rampage, his bat a blur as he struck out at the remaining workers. Jessica stood by, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with alarm. The situation had spiraled completely out of control, and Sarah could only watch in horror, wondering how this had all gone so terribly wrong. The wail of sirens grew louder, their urgency slicing through the chaos. Sarah watched in dread as the police cars screeched to a halt, their lights flashing. Officers spilled out, their weapons drawn, yelling commands at David to drop the bat and step away. David, his face twisted with rage, refused to comply, swinging the bat with renewed ferocity. "Sir, I'm only going to tell you one more time," the lead officer shouted. "Drop the weapon and get on the ground, or we will use force." David's wild eyes darted from one officer to the next, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment, Sarah dared to hope he might relent, that reason would prevail. But then, with a defiant roar, he charged towards the officers, bat raised high. The officers opened fire, their bullets finding their mark. David stumbled, the bat slipping from his grasp as he crumpled to the ground, motionless. Sarah's scream was drowned out by the cacophony of sirens and shouts. She watched in horror as Jessica rushed to her husband's side, her anguished cries piercing the air. The police swarmed the scene, securing the area and calling for emergency medical assistance. Sarah stood rooted to the spot, her mind reeling, unable to comprehend the devastating turn of events. As the paramedics tended to David's lifeless form, the lead officer approached Sarah, his expression grave. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me and answer a few questions," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Sarah nodded mutely, her legs feeling like lead as she followed the officer to his cruiser. She knew she had to cooperate, but the thought of reliving the horrific scene made her stomach churn. Once they were seated in the car, the officer turned to her, his gaze piercing. "Can you tell me what you witnessed here today?" he asked, his pen poised over his notepad. Sarah took a deep, shaky breath, her mind racing to piece together the events that had unfolded. I'm not entirely sure," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard the commotion and came outside to see what was happening. He was so angry, and then he just—" She trailed off, the haunting image of David's lifeless body searing itself into her mind. The officer nodded solemnly. "From what we've gathered, it seems your neighbor had installed an unauthorized air conditioning unit on his property, and the utility company was here to remove it. When they tried to do so, he became violent and attacked the workers." Sarah swallowed hard, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "And now he's dead," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. The officer's expression softened slightly. "I'm afraid so, ma'am." The use of force was deemed necessary to protect the officers and workers from further harm. "It's a tragic situation, but we have to follow protocol." Sarah nodded, her mind spinning with a million questions, each one more pressing than the last. How had it all gone so horribly wrong? And what would happen now? The hours that followed were a blur for Sarah. She sat in the back of the police cruiser, answering questions and recounting the events she had witnessed, her voice trembling with each word. As the investigation unfolded, the magnitude of the tragedy began to sink in. David, her once friendly neighbor, was dead, the victim of a fatal confrontation sparked by a dispute over a simple air conditioning unit. Sarah's heart ached for Jessica, who had watched helplessly as her husband's life was taken. The grief-stricken woman had been taken to the station for further questioning, her eyes red-rimmed and her expression haunted. The police had been meticulous in their investigation, combing the scene for evidence and interviewing every witness they could find. Sarah knew she had to be honest, even if it meant reliving the horrific events. As the interrogation dragged on, Sarah's mind drifted to the earlier signs she had noticed: the growing tensions between David and the utility workers, the heated arguments, the escalating anger. She couldn't help but wonder if there had been a way to diffuse the situation before it reached this tragic conclusion. Finally, the officer sitting across from her closed his notepad and let out a heavy sigh. "Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Johnson," he said, his voice laced with empathy. "I know this hasn't been easy, but your statement will be crucial to our investigation." Sarah nodded, her throat tight with emotion. What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer leaned back in his chair, his expression somber. "Well, that's the complicated part. Based on the evidence we've gathered, it appears your neighbor's actions were the primary catalyst for the escalation of this incident. However, the use of deadly force by the officers is also a matter that will require careful scrutiny." Sarah's brow furrowed. "You mean the police could be held responsible?" she asked, her heart racing. The officer nodded slowly. "It's a possibility, yes. Any time an officer discharges their weapon, especially with a fatal outcome, there are protocols and procedures that must be followed. An internal investigation will be launched, and the findings will be reviewed by the district attorney's office." Sarah felt a surge of dread wash over her. The thought of the police facing consequences for protecting themselves and the workers was almost too much to bear. She couldn't help but wonder if David's actions had ultimately led to his own demise. As the officer continued to explain the next steps in the investigation, Sarah's mind drifted back to the horrific scene she had witnessed. The sound of the gunshots, the sight of David's lifeless body, the anguished cries of his wife. It was all seared into her memory, a haunting reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of uncontrolled anger. She knew that the aftermath of this tragedy would be long and arduous, with questions and uncertainties looming large. But one thing was clear: the events of that fateful morning would forever change the landscape of her quiet, suburban neighborhood. In the days that followed, the neighborhood was shrouded in a pall of somber silence. The once vibrant community was now gripped by a sense of unease, as the residents grappled with the aftermath of the devastating confrontation. Sarah found herself consumed by a whirlwind of emotions: grief, guilt, and a deep sense of disbelief. She couldn't shake the image of David's lifeless body, the sound of the gunshots, and the anguished cries of his wife, Jessica. As the investigation into the incident continued, the media descended upon the neighborhood, their cameras and microphones capturing the raw tension that hung in the air. Neighbors, once friendly and cordial, now eyed one another with suspicion, unsure of whom to trust. Sarah, caught in the middle of this maelstrom, found herself the reluctant center of attention. Reporters sought her out, desperate for first-hand accounts and insights into the tragedy that had unfolded. How did it all go so wrong? They would ask, their eyes probing and their pens poised. Sarah would struggle to find the words, her voice wavering as she recounted the events. I don't know," she would admit, her gaze drifting to the ground. "It all happened so fast, and I couldn't stop it." The uncertainty surrounding the officers' actions only served to heighten the tension. The community was divided, with some calling for swift justice, and others defending the police's use of force. Sarah found herself caught in the crossfire, her once peaceful existence now consumed by the weight of the tragedy. She longed for the simple days when her biggest concern was the occasional neighborly dispute over a barking dog or an overgrown lawn. As the investigation dragged on, Jessica's grief transformed into a burning determination for answers. She hired a prominent civil rights attorney, vowing to hold the police accountable for her husband's death. The attorney's fiery rhetoric only added to the already charged atmosphere, as he accused the officers of excessive force and called for their immediate suspension. Sarah watched helplessly as the battle lines were drawn, her once vibrant community now torn asunder by the echoes of that fateful morning. She couldn't help but wonder if there had been a way to prevent this tragedy, if only someone had stepped in to defuse the situation before it had spiraled out of control. The what-ifs haunted her, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating consequences of uncontrolled anger. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation dragged on, the uncertainty and tension within the neighborhood only growing more palpable. Sarah found herself questioning everything: her own actions, the decisions of the police, and the lingering question of whether justice would ever be served. One thing was certain: the events of that day had forever altered the landscape of her once peaceful community, leaving a deep and indelible scar that would take time, and perhaps even a miracle, to heal. The weight of the investigation's findings cast a heavy shadow over the neighborhood, as the community grappled with the complex and often contradictory conclusions. On one hand, the police department's internal review had determined that the officers had acted within the bounds of their training and protocols, using lethal force as a last resort to protect themselves and the utility workers from David's violent assault. However, the district attorney's office had a more nuanced take on the matter. While they acknowledged the officers' adherence to policy, they also expressed concerns about the escalation of the confrontation and the potential for de-escalation tactics to have been employed more effectively. Sarah found herself caught in the middle of this turbulent debate, her own recollection of the events serving as a crucial piece of evidence for both sides. As she sat in the cramped conference room, surrounded by lawyers and law enforcement officials, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Her words, her testimony, could potentially sway the outcome of this complex and emotionally charged case. "Ms. Johnson," the district attorney began, his gaze unwavering, "can you walk us through the sequence of events as you witnessed them?" Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "Well, I heard the commotion and came outside to see what was happening. David was yelling at the utility workers, and they were trying to remove the air conditioning unit." She paused, her mind replaying the harrowing scene. "He was so angry, and then he grabbed the bat and started swinging. The workers tried to get away, but he wouldn't stop. and then the police arrived, and they— Her voice caught in her throat, the sound of the gunshots still echoing in her mind. The district attorney nodded solemnly. And from your perspective, do you believe the officers had any other options available to them in that moment? Sarah's brow furrowed as she considered the question. I don't know, she admitted, her gaze drifting to the floor. It all happened so fast, and David was so out of control. I couldn't believe it was really happening. The lawyers and officials exchanged a series of somber glances, the weight of the decision they faced palpable in the air. Finally, the district attorney spoke again, his voice measured. Ms. Johnson, your testimony has been invaluable to this investigation. While the ultimate decision rests with us, your account has provided crucial insight into the events that unfolded that day. Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her words could have such a profound impact on the outcome of this case. As she left the conference room, the weight of the responsibility she carried was palpable. She knew that the community was waiting with bated breath for the final verdict, their trust in the system hanging in the balance. And in the midst of it all, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if justice would truly be served, or if the scars of that fateful day would forever mar the once peaceful fabric of her neighborhood. The tension in the community had reached a fever pitch as the investigation's findings were finally made public. The district attorney's office had convened a press conference, their faces grave as they delivered their ruling. Sarah watched from her living room, her heart pounding, as the district attorney stepped up to the podium, the glare of the camera lights casting stark shadows on his face. After a thorough and impartial investigation, he began, his voice measured and authoritative. We have determined that the officers involved in the shooting of David Johnson acted within the bounds of their training and protocols. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd gathered outside, the air thick with disbelief and outrage. The district attorney raised a hand, silencing the chorus of protests. However, we have also concluded that there were opportunities for de-escalation that were not fully explored. The officers' actions, while justified under the law, could have been more restrained and measured. Sarah felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. On one hand, she was relieved that the officers would not face criminal charges, but the acknowledgement of missed opportunities for de-escalation only served to deepen the community's sense of unease and mistrust. As the district attorney continued to outline the investigation's findings, the tension in the crowd only continued to build. Shouts and jeers erupted, with some community members demanding the immediate dismissal of the officers involved. Jessica, David's grief-stricken widow, stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes blazing with a mixture of rage and anguish. Her attorney, a fiery and uncompromising figure, stepped forward, his voice amplified by the microphones. This is an outrage, he thundered, his words cutting through the din. The Johnson family will not accept this whitewash of justice. We will pursue every available legal avenue to hold these officers accountable for their actions. Sarah watched as the crowd erupted in a chorus of support, the air alive with the chants of justice for David, and fire the cops. As the scene unfolded, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. She understood the community's anger and desire for accountability, but she also knew that the situation was far more complex than it appeared on the surface. The district attorney's acknowledgement of missed opportunities for de-escalation had opened up a Pandora's box of questions and doubts. Had the officers truly done all they could to resolve the confrontation peacefully? Or had their actions, however justified by protocol, contributed to the tragic outcome? Sarah found herself torn, her loyalties divided between her sense of justice and her desire to see her community heal. The path forward seemed fraught with uncertainty, the wounds of that fateful day still raw and festering. As the crowd dispersed, their voices echoing in the air, Sarah knew that the battle for justice had only just begun. The future of her neighborhood hung in the balance, and she couldn't help but wonder if the scars of that day would ever truly heal. In the weeks that followed the district attorney's announcement, the community was consumed by a firestorm of controversy and unrest. The streets were a cacophony of protest, with Jessica and her attorney leading the charge for accountability and reform. Sarah found herself caught in the crossfire, her once peaceful existence now overshadowed by the constant din of rallies, marches, and heated confrontations. How can you live with yourself, knowing that your testimony helped exonerate those murderous cops? One protester shouted, his face twisted with rage. Sarah recoiled, her heart racing. I didn't have a choice, she stammered, her voice barely audible. I was just telling the truth about what I saw. The protester scoffed, his eyes narrowing. The truth? Don't give me that crap. You're just another bootlicker, defending the system that took an innocent man's life. Sarah felt her stomach churn, the weight of the accusation heavy on her shoulders. She knew that her testimony had been crucial to the investigation, but she had never imagined the backlash she would face. As the days turned into weeks, the protests only grew in intensity, with some community members even calling for the resignation of the police chief and the mayor. The air was thick with anger and mistrust, and Sarah found herself retreating further and further into the safety of her own home. One evening, as she sat alone in her living room, the sound of a persistent knocking at her door startled her. Cautiously, she peered through the peephole, her heart sinking at the sight of Jessica, her eyes red-rimmed and her expression distraught. With a deep breath, Sarah opened the door, bracing herself for a confrontation. Jessica, I'm so sorry, she began, her voice trembling. But Jessica raised a hand, silencing her. I know you were just telling the truth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't blame you for what happened. I need someone to talk to. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, and she ushered Jessica inside, her own grief and guilt momentarily forgotten. The two women sat together in silence, the only sound the muffled echoes of the ongoing protests outside. After what felt like an eternity, Jessica spoke again, her voice thick with emotion. I just can't understand it, Sarah. How could this happen? David was so full of life, so passionate about his home and his community. And now he's gone, and nothing will ever be the same. Sarah reached out and squeezed Jessica's hand, her own eyes brimming with tears. I know, she whispered. I wish I could make sense of it all, but it's just so senseless. The two women sat together, united in their shared grief and the overwhelming sense of loss that had consumed their once vibrant neighborhood. In that moment, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps, amidst the chaos and the pain, there was a path forward, one that would allow their community to heal and find a way to move on, even if the scars of that fateful day would never truly fade. As the weeks turned into months, the community's wounds began to slowly heal, though the scars remained, a constant reminder of the devastating events that had unfolded. Sarah found herself drawn into the process of rebuilding, her own grief and guilt gradually giving way to a sense of purpose and determination. Working alongside Jessica and other community members, she helped organize a series of town hall meetings, forums where residents could come together to voice their concerns, share their stories, and begin the arduous process of reconciliation. It was not an easy road, by any means. The anger and mistrust that had consumed the neighborhood in the aftermath of the shooting still lingered, and there were moments when it seemed as if the wounds would never truly heal. But gradually, through open and honest dialogue, a sense of understanding and empathy began to emerge. Residents who had once been at odds found common ground, their shared grief and desire for a better future transcending the divisive rhetoric that had once threatened to tear the community apart. Sarah found herself at the center of these discussions, her own experience and perspective lending a unique voice to the conversation. She listened intently as residents shared their stories, their hopes, and their fears, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that every voice was heard and every concern addressed. It was a slow and arduous process, but slowly the community began to heal. The protests and rallies gave way to community festivals and block parties as residents rediscovered the joy of coming together in the spirit of unity and renewal. And as the months passed, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and optimism. The tragedy that had once threatened to destroy her neighborhood had instead served as a catalyst for transformation, a painful but necessary catalyst for change. "We'll never forget what happened," Jessica said one day, as she and Sarah stood side by side, surveying the bustling activity of a community event. "But we can't let it define us. We have to move forward to build something better, stronger, and more resilient." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the faces of her neighbors, some familiar, some new, all bound together by a shared commitment to healing and progress. "You're right," she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "This isn't the end, Jessica. It's just the beginning." And as the sun set on the vibrant, revitalized community, Sarah knew that the scars of that fateful day would never truly fade. But in their place, a new foundation had been laid, one built on empathy, understanding, and a steadfast determination to create a brighter, more just future for all. The journey ahead would not be an easy one, but as Sarah looked around at the faces of her neighbors, she felt a deep sense of hope and resolve. Together, they would navigate the challenges that lay ahead, united in their shared purpose and their unwavering commitment to one another. And in that moment, Sarah knew that the true triumph would not be found in the outcome of a single investigation or the verdict of a courtroom, but in the resilience and strength of a community that had found the courage to heal, to grow, and to emerge stronger than ever before.